I don't think that one is better or worse than the other. I don't think allowing everybody to do what they want is better than leading differently. But I think it all takes a certain amount of patience to get to what works for you and the people that work with you. I don't think there is one right way. As the leader, this is something I see all of the time. As the leader, I should be dictating to everybody else what they should be doing from the day to day, right? As opposed to teaching people to think for themselves. There's one way to do it, and this is how you should do it. And if you don't do that, then you're doing it wrong.
Welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reid.
And we're here with...
I'm Nicole.
All right, that's the Digible team. And then we're also here with Cyndie. Cyndie, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. So I am Cyndie Spiegel. I'm a speaker. I'm a keynote speaker, an author of 2 books. I've written a book called Microjoys, Finding Hope, Especially When Life Is Not Okay. My first book is called A Year of Positive Thinking. I've been in this field for about 11 years after pivoting at the age of 35 from a full career in the New York fashion industry. So what I do now is I go around to companies and brands and events, and I have these incredible conversations around leadership. And for the first time, I would say, in all of my life, I am exactly where I should be, meaning this is the work that I was put on this planet to do. So I am very excited to be here with you all today to talk about it.
Maybe unpack that a minute. When you say it's the first time in your life and right now this is what you're put on to do.
Yeah.
Say more.
Yeah. So I had a whole other career before in the New York fashion industry, and we'll definitely talk about it at the summit, and we may get into it later. But, I had a career for 15 years where I didn't feel like I was able to be my full self. And today, the work that I do in the world is because of who I am. Right? Like I wouldn't be able to write books every few years or have the conversations that I have if I weren't able to show up as my full self. So somehow I inadvertently, and I say inadvertently because I didn't know it was possible, I built a career for myself that is based solely on who I am. So I never have to pretend to be anyone else when I walk into work every day. And work for me means my office or somebody else's space. Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
I was going to jump in. It sounds like Reid was too. But was there a catalyst for you, in your career where you thought, okay, I am not being my true authentic self. I have to make a change? Or did it kind of happen throughout some discovery that you did at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question because I don't think I had that language when I left the fashion industry. For me, it was more of a gut instinct. I knew that I would continue to get jobs in the fashion industry if I was very good at what I did, which is product development. I just knew that I needed to leave. And the only way that I would figure it out is if I left. And so it was spring 2013 Fashion Week. And I remember being done. It was at the Tents, which is part of New York Fashion Week in New York. We were in the Tents and I thought, this was a magnificent show. I'm done. And a week later, I went in and I spoke to the designer and I said, I've done all I can do here, but I'm finished. And I gave my notice and I never looked back. And so I think for me, part of the inquiry was simply leaving where I was. I had to get out of that situation, that comfortable place of doing what I knew how to do in order to figure out what was next. So I didn't know what was next. I certainly didn't plan for what I'm doing today. But I knew that I had to leave that place of comfort to get there.
It's amazing. Super powerful.
Yeah. Well, 2 questions there. When you do coach folks, maybe you don't coach on this scenario of are they really happy and what could be next. Instead, it seems like you mostly focus on leadership. But if I'm wrong there, let me know because I'd be curious how you would coach them, given that for you it was more instinct. Because I think more and more, and I think it's great, people are embracing their mental health, whether it's through, call it traditional therapy or career coaching, trying to better understand themselves, have somebody that can hold their hand along the way, at least for a little while. To try and help them get to a place that is more their genuine self, that they can really find joy. So I'm curious how you would talk to somebody that you might be mentoring about really identifying that. And then the second question is, how did you eventually get to this place that is so perfect for you, since you said you didn't know instantly that this is where you were going to land?
So the first question about sort of mentoring other folks who are in this place or this crossroads, again, like most of what I do is personal leadership. And the reason that's so important to me, the personal leadership piece, is because when you know who you are, it's much easier to make these decisions along the way, right? When you know that you are always working from a place of integrity, from a place of being honest with yourself, you also recognize when something doesn't feel right. Right. And, I talked about that gut instinct that I had. For me, it was most important at that time to follow it, even if I didn't know where it was going to take me. So there was a real internal trust. And part of personal leadership to me is building that relationship with yourself that I think so many of us don't have. And so when we are uncomfortable in situations, whether it be pivoting careers or moving, to a different location, whatever it is, we really get stuck and we can't get ourselves out of it because we don't have the tools. And sometimes those tools are just inquiry, like, why doesn't this feel right to me?
Could
What were
you
you going to say?
define personal leadership and then maybe give an example?
Yeah. So personal leadership to me is really how you self manage and how you self manage to show up in the world. Right. So for me, the foundation of personal leadership is your integrity, right? Is what matters most to you. Are you clear on what your core values are? How do they drive the work that you do in the world? How do they drive how you show up in the world? How do they impact the way you treat other people? So much of the work I do is around the values that are important because, this work isn't a binary. What is important to you may not be as important to me. So it's really working from a place of strength. And when you can get super clear on that, to me, you can go just about anywhere. You can do just about anything.
And do you think it's possible, or for your experience, when you said you didn't
Yeah.
know what was next, had you done the work to identify your own core values and whatnot before you left? Or is it something? Yeah, I'm just more asking, like, most people can't afford to go on a walkabout, for like
Yeah,
6
me either.
months. So
To be clear. Yes. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I couldn't afford a walkabout either. I was living in Brooklyn at the time. My apartment was $3,000 a month. It was a great loft space, which now I think sounds like a steal in Brooklyn, but that's not the point. No, I couldn't afford it either. And I had no backup plan. What I did have was a 401k. And to be clear, to be clear, I am not suggesting that other people make that same decision. What did I do the work before? Yes, ish. I had at that point, and I didn't mention this, but I have done many, many yoga teacher training certifications and meditation certifications. So I had started self inquiry probably around 27 or 28 years old. So I'd started to kind of ask myself those questions. By the time that I left my career, really not realizing I was leaving my career fully, I had done some inquiry, but not enough where it became very clear what I was going into. So what I needed to do, there were a few agreements I had to make with myself. One, what are you willing to give up? And what are you not willing to give up? Right. And I remember at the time saying, the one thing I will not give up is my apartment. This is my foundation. I worked really hard to get a beautiful loft space in Brooklyn. This I'm not going to give up, which means that there were so many other things that I had to give up, right? Like I wasn't going to the gym. I couldn't be a part of the yoga studio that I'd really built relationships in. There were many things I couldn't have. That meant I couldn't go out to eat all the time. I was going to sit at home and you were going to come to my really nice apartment. The other agreement that I made with myself was very tactical, right? And I said, this is how much money you have in the bank, because I did save some money. And I said, this is how much money you have in your 401k. You can use up to X amount of money. I spoke to my accountant at the time and said, how much can I take out before this gets really bad? And he was like, obviously the advice is none. But I knew that if I took out a little bit here and there, I would be okay. But I think the most important part for me was I knew that I would be okay. I had done enough inquiry and enough work to say, Cyndie, if you figured this out, you can figure that out. And by this, I mean, I grew up in poverty in New Jersey. This was not something that I knew. I grew up on welfare, and I talk a lot about this in my work because it was a big source of shame when I worked in the fashion industry. So for me, to sort of have a six-figure job by the time I was 28 and fly across the world, which was all part of the work that I was doing, I felt like I had done enough to be able to achieve that. And if I did that, I can figure out the rest.
Hmm.
Did that make sense?
It does make sense,
No
and
walkabouts.
yeah, and I think many people feel. I heard this recently. I'm not going to get this quote exactly right, but basically, it was that most people stand still or stay where they are because it's not bad enough. Meaning, like, if their
Mm,
situation was worse, they would be like,
yeah.
"Oh, yeah, I gotta get the heck out of here." But because it's just, like, sorta bad, they just don't do anything. So they'd almost
Mm,
be in a better situation if they were in a worse situation because it would
mhm.
cause them to take action and do something
They
about it.
hit that tipping point.
Yeah.
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 'Cause I do think there's a lot of people, and hopefully not too many at Digital, but we know there's some examples of this that folks may not feel like it's their dream role or their dream work, but they love the
Yeah.
company, and
Mhm.
so they are, call it 60%, fulfilled. It's like
Mhm.
there's a lot here that I do appreciate, I love the network, and there's parts of the work that are really fulfilling, but,
Mhm.
um, is it am I at a point where I'm willing to take that risk that you took,
Yeah.
to try and find, nirvana, if you will, like,
Mhm.
because there's no guarantees. But I think what you're saying is, try and build up and through that self inquiry enough trust, that you will land, and
Mhm.
it's better, and more often than not to take those risks than to always wonder. Because I do think that
Mhm.
over time that compounds, right? It starts to
That's
fester,
right.
even if you feel like
Mhm.
you're mostly happy. If there's kind of these hollow points,
Mhm.
then it eventually will come back to
Mhm.
you in a bad way. Yeah.
Yeah, and it will impact everything that you do, not just the work you do in the world. It will impact the relationships you have, the relationships with yourself and others. This is not something, this sort of um, discomfort or uncertainty isn't something that we can sit in and not have it affect everything in our lives. I just want to speak to what you said about trusting that you will land. The other part of this work that I think is really important is being honest with ourselves. I can't promise you that you will land.
Mhm.
Only you know that, right? Do you have the skills, the grit, whatever it takes to land if you walk away from everything you know to be true? Because I don't think that everybody does. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. There's no judgment in it. But I think we do have to be honest with ourselves when we decide to make these sorts of pivots. For me, it was never about, this job is mostly okay or it's mostly good. It was a good job. It was a good career. I loved what I did. I simply felt like I was done with it. And so sometimes I think these pivots can happen not because something is inherently wrong. We are taught to climb this ladder, and the ladder means this is my job today and that's the job I want tomorrow and so forth. But I think very few times are we taught that we can just get off the ladder altogether, get on a different ladder if we want to, or get in a boat. And so the idea was never that I wasn't happy with what I was doing. I just no longer felt like it fit who I was at that time in my life. And for many of us that may be the case. It's not about being in a bad situation, but it makes sense to me that for a lot of us we want to wait until it gets really really bad before we implode. I mean, we do that in many ways. I think we do that in relationships. We stay in relationships too long. We stay in jobs too long. We wear the same color lipstick that doesn't work for us for too long, like all kinds of things.
Yeah, that's my biggest issue.
I didn't
Uh,
want to say, but I figured it might be.
yeah, this is a light rose color. You can't really pick it up on the camera. So, I didn't give you a chance. So I don't think we heard the second part of that, which was how you then ultimately decided on this leadership,
Yeah.
mentoring, and the talks and stuff. And if I can squeeze one more in, it's still related to the same question. But did you start more with one on one, like mentoring
Mhm.
and coaching, career coaching? Because it seems harder, right, to just suddenly like be doing keynote speaking and like drawing audiences. So I'm just curious if you don't mind sharing a little bit more with that transition once you made the decision to finding this sweet spot and how it all kind of staged out.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is I haven't found anything yet. I think it's all evolving always. When I first left the fashion industry, and again, I think this is just part of that work you do with yourselves. Like I've always been quite optimistic. I knew that I would land. Um, but I was kind of floundering for a little while. I was holding these six-person yoga classes in my apartment. Again, it was like I used what I had to do what I had to do at the time, which sounds much more sinister than it is. It was just yoga people. Um, I did that and I got a call from one of my graduate school professors and he said, "Cyndie, I really think you should consider teaching." So I went to my alma mater in New York City and I started teaching. And then I was getting these evaluations, like other faculty evaluate you. And one of the faculty that evaluated me said, not seen many people who can teach the way you do. I think you should come to Parsons and teach. So I said, okay, sure. Like basically at that point in my life, I just said yes to most things. Like if I didn't have anything to do, I didn't have any money coming in, I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And I know that sounds quite privileged to say, look, I was teaching at one great school and then somebody else came in and invited me to, but it kind of is what happened. But I think the deeper lesson is that I just kept saying yes to things. And then somebody, I think it was one of my students at Parsons at the time, says, I want to start a fashion company. I want to start this brand. Do you know what I can do? So I had this conversation, and then that person asked me to talk to somebody else that they knew. So when I left the fashion industry, I started coaching and mentoring folks who wanted to start fashion businesses, because I had spent a 15, 16 year career on the business side of fashion. So that I can do. So it was these sort of small steps along the way that landed me in where I was. So I went from that to doing, sort of group mentoring for women. I think it was women specifically at the time who wanted to start fashion businesses. So it was really quite niche then. And then I eventually started to realize it didn't matter what kind of business it was. It was the same principles. And it expanded from there. And the first time that I started speaking publicly was I think it was about starting a fashion business that was at this very small event in Utah or Ohio. And I had never been on a stage before. And the second now when I say stage, it was like a small conference room. It was hardly a stage, but there were people in front of me. And I never felt more myself. And the weirdest thing happened, that there was a line of people waiting to talk. Now, I didn't think anything I said was that interesting. I was talking about starting, I think, a fashion business, or starting a business. I think it was like starting a business at 35 or something. And then I got an invitation to speak at another event and another event, and it just kept snowballing. And so this personal leadership, I think, was really just inherently what I was doing, but didn't necessarily have a name for since I was in my late 20s. And it just became sort of my own brand of talking about these things and getting invited to larger and larger events. And for the most part, it's what I do full time now. And it's fantastic, but it was not the plan. I'm not even sure outside of Tony Robbins, I knew this was a job.
Yeah. Well, I have 10 more questions, but
Yeah, no, I was kind of going to build off of what you said earlier on just like what we're seeing with our staff and our company, but then with our experience over the years and with, how the world is changing, we've
Mm,
seen it go from work as work to work and life integration. And that has
yeah.
put more pressures, on us as employers to kind of be all
Mhm.
things to all people. So we want to be your great
Mhm.
employer. We want to be your great purpose. And so we try to be all facets. I
Mhm.
think that is very challenging. And so my question to you is like, how are you seeing that with the work that you're doing, with the leadership
Mhm.
goals that you see folks come in and have? And how are you thinking about that evolution?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because the first thing I would say is that you can't be everything to everyone. I
Totally.
say this all the time. I'm like, you are not for everyone. You being a brand, a business, an event, or an individual, right? We can't be everything to everyone. But with work and personal integrating, it feels that way. And I think the only thing we can do as employers is to allow our teams to have agency, right? Allow them, really sort of give them the tools to understand who they are so that they are making decisions for themselves, because you can't do that for them, right? As an employee, your job stops at some point along the way. And this idea that there's blurred lines is like, yes, and folks have to have individual agency to decide what they want to do. It's not really up to the employer to have to figure that out. And I think that that's something we're seeing more and more, which is why these skills, these individual skills, become so important from an employer perspective, not just to the individuals themselves, because you want to be able to offer that to your team, to your people, so that they know how to self-manage as well. They know when to say they have to go. They know how to make the best decisions for work and themselves. But that's not
Absolutely.
an easy thing.
Yeah, and as we offer that, I think it's forcing the 3 of us to also be along that journey, right? Like, we're doing our
Yes.
own self-development work and growth, and,
Mhm.
if we're gonna have these conversations, we have to, show up for them. So
Right.
it's been a good journey for us to be on, but I think for me personally, I did not expect that, when we first started the business
Mm.
6.5 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. And do you think that, because this is something that I've seen quite a lot that I think is quite impactful, is when leadership can mirror certain behaviors for their team, right? So, for example, I want you to have work-life balance, then you can't be there till 10 o'clock at night,
Absolutely, yep.
And how have you seen that? I'm not the interviewer here, but how have you seen that sort of become really helpful for your team?
I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is boundaries. So
Yes.
both with, as you're
Mm.
mentioning, work-life balance, but then also boundaries for our clients, just
Yes.
speaking openly of like where we begin and end,
Mhm.
what can we do, where do we provide the most value?
That's right.
Because, as the business has evolved, I think early on we wanted to just go and be up above and beyond 24/7. And
Do all the
now,
things.
yes, and now I'm really spending time thinking through where are we providing the most value and how can we double down
Yeah.
on that?
Mm, and then your team sees that, right? And I think something you said that was just so important is boundaries. You having those boundaries, right? Your team then can you're really showing them what that looks like and saying it's okay that we can't be everything and we can't do everything,
Yes.
because
That
then the
said,
expectation isn't that they will be everything either.
yeah, that said, it's definitely David and I, and probably Nicole to a degree, but I think you're aware, Cyndie, we moved to a 4-day work week.
Mhm.
So that's something we did a couple of years ago. It was as you can imagine, a huge move. A lot of people
Mhm.
saw it as risky, some inside and out and more outside the organization.
Mhm.
But we ensured them, A, it was not a test, that we weren't going back. So that was pretty important for them to hear.
Mhm.
And B, that, we felt we would actually come out stronger, because the idea is more that work-life balance or integration, as some are calling it, and that,
Yes.
people would be more energized, happier, more recharged, etc., and that we could actually be more efficient as a result. And fortunately, all
Mhm.
of that played out. It was great. But
Mhm.
I would own the fact that I did not take 4-day work weeks for the first year,
Mhm.
and
Sure.
maybe even the first year and a half. So I wasn't mirroring, I guess the behavior that I was looking for, but I didn't see it as much as behavior. And where I'm going with this, back to your, like, it's a personal discovery, self inquiry. I
Mhm.
love to work, and
Mhm.
so I really came at it somewhat selfishly, a little bit, where I'm like, I have
Mhm.
3 kids and, raising a family, and I want to walk my girls to the bus every day and just spend more
Yes.
time and be there for them on Friday. But I also know myself. I do enjoy working. There's a lot of things that healthy or not, that sounds terrible. I hope it's healthy. My point is that I would love for us to have an environment that we're mirroring more often than not, but that
Mhm.
when somebody sees me online on a Friday, that they're
Mhm.
not now feeling this pressure. It's like, well, there's the
Yes.
CEO. Look at he's back online on Friday. That means that really we should be working on Friday. So that, to me, is our ultimate goal, is that there are
Mm.
different people here that have different interests, and not all of them are
Mhm.
like skiing. Sometimes it could be work, and that's okay.
Mhm. Mhm. The personal
Tricky.
agency, right? It is tricky, but what I want to just clarify though is what you just said. We created this 4-day work week for Digible, but that doesn't mean that I worked 4 days a week. Personal agency is saying you don't have to.
Right.
That doesn't mean that's not the only way that we mirror, right? Mirroring the behaviors that we want to see sometimes says it is up to me to decide how much I want to work. As the leader in this organization, I don't need you to work 5 hours. I mean, you do need them to work 5 hours. You don't need them to work 5 days a week, but if you choose to, that's okay. So what you're teaching is choice. Right? You're saying this is what we are
Exactly.
suggesting. If you want to work more, you're welcome to, but please understand, and this is where you just have to reiterate it, this is not the expectation. This is not necessary for the job you have. With that said, if there's something that you want to do and you want to come in on that fifth day, you're welcome to. That's personal agency.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to clarify that. I think it's harder, and it's understandable that I'll call it our more seasoned employees had
Yeah.
a harder time probably with that,
Yeah.
because that's not what they had seen, where they had worked before, and so it was, I think. yeah, just a more difficult transition in many ways. So used to working 5 days a week, or if you see, me or David working, that you feel like, well, that's actually what they mean. Whereas
Yeah.
some of the next generation, if you will, coming in, didn't have precedent, weren't air quotes institutionalized, and so they
Sure.
were maybe a little bit quicker or more comfortable transitioning to a 4-day work week, and not
Mhm.
being too focused on maybe what their manager or senior leadership was doing.
Mhm.
I want to somewhat pivot here, but you mentioned the tooling. That's big for us at Digible. It's been a huge part of us building the company, our success. We just call it frameworks. It's like,
Mm.
and so much of it has been oriented around scale, but there's a lot of frameworks now that Nicole has
Mm.
helped lead as far as our employee experience.
Mm.
So I'm curious, the tooling you're speaking of with like self inquiry,
Mhm.
how much of that, I guess, you built kind of from the ground up versus
Mhm.
stitching together best practices, things you've read or experienced, etc. And then if you
Mhm.
could, talk a little bit more about the tooling itself.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you an answer you probably aren't going to like, and I'm just warning you because I'm going to say it anyway. I don't know how much any of us really makes up. Meaning so much of the inquiry that I do is based on a lot of philosophy, a lot of reading, a lot of seeing what other folks are doing and what works. A big part of the self inquiry that I talked about for me, and this isn't something that works for everybody, is that I sit every day and meditate for 20 minutes. I'm not a pusher of meditation, but that's a tool that works for me. The 4-hour work week. I didn't create that. You didn't create that, but more weeks than not, I work 4 hours a week. Why do I keep saying
four
hours?
day.
I'm starting to feel like I work a lot less than I
Yeah,
think.
our employees are really going to like
We
you. We're moving from four
really
days a
are.
week to
You're
4 hours.
manifesting it.
If we could, I do like to manifest. No, but I think that there are many of the tools that I use are because I've learned them from someone else. And I don't think that that makes them less valid or less important. I don't need to create everything. It's been out there. My job is to study. My job is to read. My job is to, when I say my job, I mean what I do in the world really comes from being around folks that are doing really valuable, important work and staying in connection with people and community and learning. And I think that if more of us understood that we didn't have to create it, we might be doing more in the world,
Yeah,
you know?
makes a
So the
ton of
answer
sense.
is how much of this framework is my own? Most of it's not, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think what is my own personal integrity, right? That's something that's my own. And that's what I build through a lot of self-study, but it's not through a framework that I've created.
Yeah, well, I totally appreciate the candor, and I think we're similar. There are some things you can imagine that, well, I'll say we made up, but it's the whole thing that nobody has an original thought, right? It's all
Yeah.
coming from somewhere. So I totally grant that, and we try to do a good job, the three of us, of basically similar to what you're saying, reading, researching, like drawing from as many data points, if you will, examples. And then testing, because you don't know whether it's the right tool, the right framework. Like you said,
Mhm.
meditation for some is not for the next person, and
Totally.
so it's a little
Mhm.
harder to do company wide, because at some point you start to get committed to those frameworks. But we still try to
Yes.
offer, I think, a fair amount of flexibility in how we operate.
Mm. And I think when it comes to reading and self-study and educating, so much of that is on us as the individuals to learn that, right? And to be in touch with what matters to us. And the more we can teach that to other people and mirror that for other people, the better off we all are. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of good tools and techniques and frameworks that already exist in the world. And I think this partially comes from having a prior career in product development. I'm not afraid to try things and see if they don't work. Like if they work, great. If they don't work, I'll let them go. But I think for so many of us, when it comes to trying different frameworks or thoughts or ideas, we really think we have to stick to it forever and sort of
Mhm.
force our way through. And again, as a product developer by trade, I don't feel that that's the case. I'm like, I can try some things out and see what works for me. Is this going to help me with my habits? Is this going to help me be more productive? Because it helps a million other people doesn't mean it's going to work for me or for you. And so I think that's the agency again. Let's try, let's adapt, but not hold ourselves to it if it doesn't work for us, like meditation, for example.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing and a through like a thread throughout the conversation is it's what everyone always says where it feels almost cliche, but where it's a
Mhm.
journey. I think I've gotten really hung up on the past on like right and wrong. Was I wrong here? Or was I right
Mm.
here? Versus hey, it's continual forward momentum. And to your point, if you
Mhm.
think of yourself as a product, that is a very different experience because I'll just say a tech product is never complete. It's always
Right.
getting tweaked and will forever. And so you have to be okay with that, that it's a
Mhm.
journey, right? And you as
Mhm.
an individual are a journey.
Mm, mm. And if we are nothing but tech products, are we? But it is a journey. It really is a journey, right? Like that is what life is. And something I talk about a lot, you mentioned good, I think it was good or bad. What was the
Yeah.
Right or
binary
wrong?
you
Yeah,
just
right or
mentioned? Right
wrong,
or
good or
wrong.
bad. I'll
Thank
take
you.
either, but I was very true false binary in the way I
Yes.
was perceiving myself.
That's what I was just going to mention, is this binary, in my most recent book, Microjoys, which may not come up much here, I talk about grief and loss, or joy and grief, and how we can experience those at the same time. And I think this idea of not needing to be binary exists across the ways in which we lead, right? Like most things are not good or bad or right or wrong if we allow ourselves to be in that gray space. And most of us don't want to do that because black or white is an answer and we like answers. We want to find an answer in a book. We want to listen to a podcast that tells us how to live in the world. And to be outside of that binary certainly feels a lot more difficult because there is no one right way to be. But that is agency. That is personal agency and saying, hey, you know what? Maybe neither of these things are the right choice for me. Maybe this isn't right or wrong. Maybe there's a lot of gray and I get to decide where I am on that spectrum.
And
Ye-
is that I'm just gonna jump in real quick on that because that is definitely something I feel just passionate about. Like, is that a skill that you had to practice or a muscle that you had to flex? I think back when I was in an intense period of grief,
Yeah.
having a little moment of joy, it would be like, "Oh no, no, you can't be happy right now because you're sad." And so I
Yeah.
had to like almost recondition my brain to be like, "Oh no, you can actually feel this micro joy," to use your your
Mhm.
expression, and that's
Mhm.
okay. But it took me a while, I think, for myself to accept that.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I don't know that I was always that way, but I will say, growing up as a biracial Black Jew, I've always lived a non binary way. Like, I didn't really fit in anywhere, right? So I think a little bit was inherent in me not to not fully need an explanation for something to feel okay. When it came to joy and grief, I think that the ability to be uncomfortable or to not understand was not foreign to me. To be okay not fully understanding was not foreign to me. And I think that much of that really is from having, spending the last 20 years in inquiry, to say, you know what, I've seen so many different ways of getting to the same place that I know there's multiple ways of being. But I think that for a lot of us, we have to practice that. Like, in what ways is this not right or wrong, particularly in a divisive world, the one that we live in
Right.
today, where we're cutting people out because we don't like who they voted for. We're cutting people out because we don't like the color of their shoe. I mean, I hope you're not cutting people out because of the color of their shoes, but it feels like you might in this day and age. So something that I always suggest to folks who find this concept difficult is to put yourself in situations where you are less familiar often. So have conversations with strangers if you never talk to strangers. Do things that feel a little bit uncomfortable, because the more we allow ourselves to sit in discomfort, the more likely we are to really understand the depth of this non-binary world we live in. I didn't mean to get that deep. I feel like that just went real deep for no reason. But,
I'm here
I,
for it.
I do
That's great.
think, I do think that we need to surround ourselves with folks that are different than we are in many different ways, whatever that means to you. We have to listen to conversations that are not our own, that aren't in our own silo. And the more we do this, the more we learn the skill of holding multiple things at once. And when we learn that, we know that there isn't just one right way to do something.
Amazing. Thank you for that answer.
Can
You're
you, Cindy,
welcome.
maybe if we sort of change directions a little bit, I'm curious about what, based on your opinion or what you've seen, what do many people get wrong about leadership? What are some misconceptions about leadership?
That there's one right way to do it, and that top-down leadership is all there is. All the time, even today, that there is one right way to do it. And as the leader, this is something I see all of the time. As the leader, I should be dictating to everybody else what they should be doing from the day to day, right? As opposed to teaching people to think for themselves. There's one way to do it, and this is how you should do it. And if you don't do that, then you're doing it wrong. So it kind of goes back to this binary, when it comes to leadership. So I think even as leaders, understanding that the people who work with and around you have something to offer, it allows us to be able to situationally lead better, but that's not always the case. So I think if we could really engage people in the act of leadership, we'd all be better off for it.
And what do you think is the root cause of that? Meaning the top down or feeling like you have to dictate? Because one of the things we I don't know if it's struggle with, but sometimes we're actually on the opposite side, and maybe that
Mm,
better to be on that side, but where we're offering too much autonomy, and as
hmm.
employers, you get nervous about that because it's
Yes,
like, what if they make too many mistakes, and then
yes,
I know who ultimately owns this. That's me, and
correct.
so maybe that's just a good springboard for you. But at its core, yeah, what do you think is really the root cause of that issue with leadership?
I think particularly of a certain generation, it's just what we know to be true. Right? It's how we've grown up, but I think also it allows us to feel in control. Listen, we don't have control of most things, but I think it allows us to feel like we do. And so I understand inherently why people may lead from that place. And to speak specifically to the opposite end of it, I think anywhere where we have two extreme um, realities, whether it's not leading at all or leading too much, we have to find a middle. Any trends and any business that I've ever experienced, we're going to find one of two, and then we're going to eventually swing to the middle. But it takes a little while to get there. So sometimes that means starting with being a little dictatorial, or sometimes it means letting everybody do what they want and realizing that doesn't work either, to find that middle ground. So I think there is a little bit of grace that's needed too. Right. I don't think that one is better or worse than the other. I don't think allowing everybody to do what they want is better than leading differently. But I think it all takes a certain amount of patience to get to what works for you and the people that work with you. I don't think there is one right way,
Yeah,
but
makes
you do have to lead.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I would love to get your thoughts on, I said one thing, I've already asked you like 12 questions, but is how do you coach leaders about feedback? I guess,
Yeah.
and getting feedback, being active, you mentioned actively listening, but it
Mhm.
occurred to me like a lot of times when I'm coaching my direct reports or having one-on-ones, it still
Mhm.
feels like I'm mostly giving the feedback versus getting it.
Mhm.
So I'm trying
Mhm.
to be more intentional myself, like at the end of one-on-ones or in performance reviews. Hey, how am I doing? And there's certain things we have
Mhm.
in place that are ensuring that. But I just think it's so critical. Again, back to like what we know. I think a lot of times is one-way feedback. Um,
Mm. Mhm.
meaning you're giving it as a leader, not necessarily, getting it. So yeah,
Yeah.
thoughts there?
Yeah. Yeah. So when you say you're giving feedback, are you in these? What's the purpose of the meeting? I guess I would ask, because most people don't go into a meeting saying, "Today I'm going to tell my boss about themselves." It's just not a natural way to be. Um, so are you wanting them to give you feedback about your leadership, or what's your hope?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I try to be as self-aware as I can, and
Hmm.
maybe my position's a little bit more unique than some of our other leaders, but I don't want to act like
Yeah.
it's overly unique. Just as far as the comfort that somebody might have providing feedback to
Hmm.
the three of us,
Hmm.
given that we're the founders and employers of the company. But I don't want to get
Hmm.
sidetracked here. I just when I'm Sometimes I actually want to get feedback on the feedback I'm giving. So
Hmm.
meaning I'm in a one-on-one and it's like, "Hey, I noticed
Yes.
that you did great in that meeting the other day. I really love this strategy, but in this area, I noticed that, it's been difficult for you to like get this over the finish line, blah, 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 whatever."
Yeah.
And I'm hungry enough just to say, hey, how did that land? Did that
Yes.
delivery? But then I also am interested, just timely, specific feedback. It's like, hey, I just led a roundup this morning.
Mhm. Mhm.
Was there parts of it that just didn't make sense to you, that I wasn't clear or whatever? And I'm not trying to
Mhm.
overdo that. I just want to balance it better, because I feel like
Yeah.
more often than not, meetings that I have, I'm the one providing the feedback, and that makes it
You're
hard for me to grow if I'm always the one giving, not getting.
Isn't this the challenge of being a leader?
Yeah.
Right? It's like you're always the one giving, but you're not necessarily receiving. I think that there are different ways that we can go about it. One is making sure that when you're having these conversations with your team, that it is a two-way conversation. Because sometimes, the feedback that you give, you may not receive it in the exact same language. Right. So you may be looking for something that is not necessarily going to happen. Maybe they're not going to say, hey, Reid, you did a great job. That was a great meeting. Right. That may not be the way it sounds, but what you are listening for is clues.
Mhm.
Right. So it's not as direct. And I know that you'd really like that. You really want to know how you're doing because you're hungry to hear it. But it's really about actively listening for clues. Do they understand? Is this a two-way conversation? Because if somebody is shut down, it's not a two-way conversation. So the fact that they're engaging with you, that is a clue,
Yeah.
right? So you're listening for clues, and maybe it's not as obvious as the feedback that you're given. And there are certainly ways that you can go about getting that, but it's not necessarily going to be sitting in a meeting and saying, hey, how did I do? Because you are still their boss,
Yeah,
and
totally.
so you really just have to listen for the nuance in conversations.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot here to tie together, Cyndie, but at the beginning, it seemed like you were talking a lot about self agency and personal
Hmm.
leadership. And what I took from that is know who you are and know what you want, know what's important to you.
Mm.
And in our case, many folks, or I'll say, yeah, in our case, but I'll just say generally in Western society, many folks haven't done that work. And so they're
Yes.
just very reactive and they're just like existing. And so,
Hmm.
like, let's just say in this example, Reid goes into a meeting with them. They're just existing like, hey, I got my stuff done today, but they don't think in like as if they have a seat at the table to like give feedback back to Reid. So
Hmm.
if they've done that work, I think then maybe they'll have the self-confidence to say like, hey, what's really important to me is this. So Reid, when you do that
Hmm.
thing, I don't receive it as well. So in absence of that, so one would
Hmm.
be it's important for us to encourage our staff to go through these exercises, which may
Hmm.
disrupt some of them and they may realize that this is not what they want and they may flee. But then
Hmm.
those that stick around decide, hey, this is what I want and I have a seat at the table and here's how I'm going to take, as you're saying, like agency with that. And also I'll
Hmm.
speak back to Reid. In the meantime, there's a transition period because we won't get 100% compliance on this, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yep.
everyone, their journey goes at their own pace.
Yep.
So then Reid needs his own tooling in order to
Mhm.
get the feedback he craves. So
Mhm.
Alex, our new head of product, I had a one-on-one with him last week, and he is now in 3 different one-on-ones. He asked me the question, David, what is something you've wanted to say to me but have been reluctant to, or have not told
Mm.
me yet? And so he forces it. Like the first time he asked, I was like, shoot, I don't know what. And then the second time I was a little bit more prepared, but he
Yes.
just like he pulls it out of me. It's like because he I think has
Mhm.
done a lot of this work you're talking about. So he's secure in
Mhm.
asking for it. Um,
Yep.
and so that's how he gets his almost I could see him doing the reverse because with his own reports.
Yep. I kinda love is it Alex?
Yeah.
Hey, Alex, good job.
Yeah.
But that's something too that we could learn, right? Is like, why can't we say at the end of every conversation and have that just be part of the way these conversations go so that
Mm.
no one feels targeted necessarily? It's like at the end of every conversation, this is what we're going to say.
Mm-hmm.
What is something that I love that question, right? What is something that you've maybe been hesitant to say to me? Because I think so much of it, and that the reinforcement piece is important. Because to your point, right, you're like, the first time I didn't really know what to say. And then the second time I was more prepared.
Mm-hmm.
That's why reinforcement matters, right? We're asking these questions, but we're also doing it consistently so that folks are more prepared for it. So if they haven't been doing, and even if they've been doing a lot of self inquiry, doesn't necessarily mean that you have the confidence to ask, to take a seat at the table in every room. As leaders, that's part of our jobs to help folks to build that confidence in them. But I love the idea of ending every one of those conversations with that question, just as a general strategy within the company. Because then
Mm-hmm.
we're used to this two-way conversation around feedback.
Mm-hmm. And making it feel safe, right? Like
Yes.
if you do it at the
Yes.
end, maybe you don't have time to get into it. Be like, man, I appreciate that feedback. I'll think on this and bring it back up next time or something. Because then
Great.
it doesn't feel like, oh shoot, that particularly if you're getting cut off at the end of your time, right? That you're
Yeah.
rushing it to get a solve. It's just more of like, oh, you've been heard, and let me
Yep.
reflect on that, and
Mhm.
then
And
it
we're
feels safe.
normalizing.
Hmm.
It's safe and it's being normalized that this is a two-way conversation, right? Like we know this is going to happen. It's so I know that I'm expected to have answers as well and to have thoughts as well. So I love that exact statement at the end. By the way, when I say the end, I don't mean when somebody's like picking up their notepad and getting
Hmm.
ready to walk out. Part of it is also being able to say, okay, we've got 10 minutes left, and then maybe ask that question.
Yeah. Well, I like that
Mhm.
you brought up early on about tools and exercises and how later you said it, not everything works for everybody, right? So you gotta
Yeah.
figure out what your bag of tools, what works for you.
Hmm.
But if you were to more generalize and say this is where someone should start this journey, how
Yeah.
would you tell them sort of like the first 3 steps to the journey? Like what should they focus on?
Mm-hmm. The first thing I might say, or the first question I might ask is, who are you? Which is really, really hard. But it's like, by the way, there's no answer to this question. It's a question that we spend the rest of our
I'm
lives trying
hearing
to
there's a
answer.
wrong answer to this question.
There is a wrong answer. No, there is no answer to this. And it's one of the questions that really drove me to make as many changes as I have, is trying to understand this, right? Like, wait a minute, if I am not my job, if I am not these titles, then who am I? Because again, it gets us to come back to like our own integrity. So simply asking ourselves, who are we? And writing that down or typing it. Do people say typing anymore? What do we say when we're using a key? But how do you describe that?
Voice dictating.
Touche. But really, like answering that and doing, like sitting down 20 minutes. Who am I? Writing everything that happened. Now, you're going to keep asking yourself this until you get to some core information, right? If you take away father, wife, daughter, child, partner, whatever it is, you're going to get to some really core information, and it's going to eventually get you to a place to you answering the question, what's important to me? Which is the next question that I ask, is what is important to you? What are your core values? And that's not something we're going to get into now, but honestly, anybody can Google it. And there is a list of them, hundreds of things for you to choose from. And sometimes having those sort of lists are really important just to give you the language, because if you don't have the language, you wouldn't necessarily know how to answer that question. So it's using the internet in that way. So who are you? What are your values? What is important to you? And the other point that I would suggest is spending more time alone, not in front of a device. Because the ability to allow yourself to think is something that is very, very limiting, like, or limited. We don't do it enough, but when we do, ideas and thoughts pop up for us.
Hmm.
And we have to listen to them, but we don't often do that. There's always something to occupy our time. And so when we take, again, like for me, it's meditation, but for you, it may just be sitting for 10 minutes a day with no devices and just sitting and getting comfortable with your own thoughts, and then starting to record what those thoughts are, which might not sound very fun, but I promise you it does get to some core work eventually, which is answering some of those first two questions.
Yeah, it can be very telling. I actually have a therapist right now that I'm seeing, and she suggested the same thing. And even though she's
Mm,
not my therapist or ours, we have a facilitator out in Boulder that's working with us on this operating platform that we use for the company. And she gave me also that feedback of, hey,
mm,
self reflection is important. Just give yourself some time to think, Reid. And
yeah.
the team, I guess, laughed a little bit because I can't seem to turn it off.
Mm,
I have the label of visionary at the company, but just always,
mhm,
I feel like I'm always thinking. And so when I got that feedback from Margaret and Boulder, and then my therapist, I was like, I don't know what to do because I'm always thinking. And
mm,
she was
mm,
like, You're overthinking it. And she said, just sit down out on your patio and just be.
mhm,
And what came to me though was like all this stress. And so
mhm.
but I'm going to say that's okay on some level. It just tells me back to who we are and what's important to us and where we're trying to get.
Yeah.
That when I sat down and just tried to like think, I just
Mhm,
got hit with a wave of stress. It's like,
mm,
well, that's something I really need to when I say lean into, not meaning more stress, but really
Right.
examine and see how I
Yeah.
can improve that equation instead of like,
Mhm.
hey, just think on one topic, like, and that might be suggestion for somebody else. But when I
Mhm.
just try to like decompress and just, it's so difficult for me.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm working on that, but that by itself was in a way a win. It's like just
Yeah.
to recognize that for 10 minutes for me, that was the outcome.
Mm. And thank you for saying that, and thank you for sharing that. Are you familiar with the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique?
I'm not.
It's used for anxiety. I also talk about it in Microjoys, but it's this idea. It's basically a way to get ourselves still and present in any moment. Because when my brain also goes a million miles a minute. It's very hard to turn it off. So I don't try to turn it off anymore. So when I say I sit and meditate, it's not because it's quiet. I literally have mala beads that are in my office because I have to have something to touch in order to keep my brain focused. But the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique is 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch. You know what? I'm just going to make sure I'm giving this to you right. Look around, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Now, I know I went through that quickly, but the beauty of that technique is that it grounds you in this moment because you're being forced to pay attention, and it really sort of brings you back to the present moment. So when your mind is going a million miles a minute like yours or mine seems to do relentlessly, this gives you a moment to just kind of come back here. And when we are back at that neutral space, it allows us to really have a certain calmness and a certain presence to think about things differently. But perhaps also letting go of this idea that you have to not think just because you're sitting.
Totally. I love it.
Do you have any other non-negotiables for you outside of meditation that you have found are a part of your daily life and practice?
Yes, saying no a lot.
I
Truly.
love that.
Saying yes is something that we're programmed to do. And I say no to more things that I say yes to anymore. When I started out earlier, I said I didn't know what I was doing with my life. So I said yes to everything.
Mhm.
Yes, I'll teach this. And sometimes yes is where we need to be. But there are also moments in our lives where we get to a place where we have to own saying no. No to sometimes really great opportunities, because just because they're great doesn't mean they're great for me. So I think saying no is a really important one. That is a non-negotiable. But so is saying yes, but it has to be a very deep yes when I do say it, whether it's about work that I take on, work that I'm going to write, people that I'm going to have dinner with, everything. If it's a yes, it's a very big yes for me.
That's great.
It seems like that is probably, tell me if I'm wrong here, Cyndie, but because of where you're at with your journey. Like, you are
Mhm.
very clear about what's important to you. It's not that different from Reed and I read Essentialism
Mm,
in the last year, and
yeah.
the theme for me there is you have to know exactly what you want, what you're going for. Versus like
Mhm.
Nicole and I have a 10-month-old, and when he
Mm,
starts playing sports, he won't know that he wants to be a, I don't know, baseball or something, right? So
mhm.
he may need to sample everything to then
Sure.
determine, okay, yep, no, I want to focus on baseball now. So is
Yeah.
that fair? Like, for you personally, that's why you get to say no a lot now, is because you're very clear on that direction?
Yes, yes, and no.
Okay.
Yes and no, meaning I get to say no a lot right now because I've just come out of a really difficult place. So no is the only way I get to ground myself. But me saying no to me is more of uh, an evolution, right? I'm not always going to be here. I'm not always going to say no. Ask me in 6 months, I might be in a place of saying yes more often. So I think what it comes from is a place of knowing what I need in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we've got to sample everything first.
Yeah, I think, Nicole, maybe you're the first one to say this to me, but I've been hearing it more and more, but it's almost like, what season are you in right now?
Yes,
And so that starts to make it more clear to me, back to it's a journey, right? Like, so the
that's
season right
right.
now is, maybe you wouldn't want to brand it the season of no, Cyndie, but
I'm
it's not what you
fine
mean.
with branding it that.
Okay.
I'm okay with branding it that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the season of no. No, truly.
Yeah.
It is, and that's okay.
Well, you've already given the audience amazing advice and tips, but
Mhm.
specifically, what advice do you have for, female leaders looking to either enter the C-suite, executive levels? There's not a lot of female leaders at the top right now, and so what advice do you have for them?
First thing is make clear that that's what you want. right? Because so often we're waiting for things to get handed to us as women. We're waiting for somebody to tell us that we're ready, to tell us that we're enough, to tell us that we've learned all the things. So the very first piece of it is let it be known that that is what you are working towards. And I know that that sounds simple, but it is, believe it or not, it's very rare that anybody does that.
That's great. Or yeah, or they think that maybe they want that. Like to your point, doing the inner
Mhm.
work to be like, this is actually what I want, and now I can be vocal and say that. I love that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then, if you could give advice to your teenage self or your little
Yeah.
girl, what would you say?
Be more myself. I wish that I knew when I was a teenager that being myself was ultimately what was going to allow me to be the most successful and the most authentic. You know, as a teenager, we're just trying to be everyone else around us. We're these chameleons that take on everyone else around us and our surroundings. And I think we move into adulthood learning that same thing. And the only way that I was able to shed that was to do the complete opposite, which is where I am today. And I wish I knew then that I would be okay being myself.
I think what makes that so difficult, if I can, because I have three
Yeah.
girls, twin
Mhm.
13-year-olds and a 10-year-old girl, and we're constantly trying to enforce that message of be yourself.
Yeah.
Try to stand up for what you feel is right, etc. And what I'm coming to the realization of is the further they get, the more it's about their peers,
Yes.
in supporting that. Because mom and dad can say that, and I won't give a recent specific example, um, out of the privacy of my daughter. She probably
Yes.
every now and then she
Who
listens.
doesn't want you to
Yeah,
tell?
believe it or not, every now and then she does listen, and she'd be like, "Dad, you should have covered that off with me." But yeah, she was like, "Well, you're not at school. You're not the one that's gonna have to
Yeah,
deal with this, and so it's
that's
way
right.
easier, and you're an adult. You've matured, you found yourself, you can say all this stuff to me." And then I did try to empathize as much as I can, reflect back on what it was like to be a
Mhm.
13-year-old boy, in middle school, much
Yeah.
less a girl, and how hard it was
Yeah.
to stand up for myself and find myself and whatnot. And then I take it a step further. I'm like, man, so much of that was just the people that I was friends with. They were
Yeah.
constantly putting that pressure on me. And so what I think where they found the most progress is through their friends, when they found the right friends
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
really support that within them. So I just say
Mhm.
that, I guess, to parents, like, it's so critical that your kids are surrounded by the right people, and it doesn't change as you get older. If you're
Yeah.
at the wrong company or you have the wrong people that you're hanging out with, it
Mhm.
always is a big influencer in how well you can toe that line, I guess.
That's right. And I think, again, what would I tell my teenage self? My teenage self would need to know that, but my teenage self would not listen. If that makes sense,
Yep.
like
Exactly.
so many of these lessons and learnings, it's like, well, sure, in hindsight, 30 years later, I can give you this advice, but I wouldn't listen. But what I can say is that I had a mother who consistently told me that I can be weird and I could be myself. And so when the dust settled and I was well into my 20s, I realized that I could because I still had that in the back of my mind. Even if there was that 10-year period of time where I was like, you don't understand, it stuck. It did stick rather, but I couldn't hear it then. And chances are, Reed, your kiddo can't hear it now. That doesn't mean they're not listening.
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's also, you try to celebrate when you see those moments happen, even if they don't
Yes.
happen much, because the older you get, then maybe you start to lean into that more, and more
Yeah.
regularly you're saying no, or you're, I guess, upholding those core values, on a daily
Mhm.
basis. But when they're kids, it isn't going to happen as much, and so you need to be there, and celebrate that win when it does, and that will hopefully help
That's right.
reinforce the behavior.
Well,
That's right.
Nicole, you are founder and C-suite, so I want to reverse the question. What would you tell your teenage self?
My teenage self, I think for me right now, what's present for me is trying to kind of rework the paradigm of like hustle culture,
Mm,
especially coming out of this season of the startup that we're in, of like just hustle, 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 like work, work, work. That was definitely a value that was instilled in me from very early on. And so while I do grant that as partially credited for my success, I would also tell myself that it is okay to be silly, to have fun. Like I very much have a serious demeanor. And so now I'm trying to be like, okay, how can you have more fun? How can you be more silly? And that is okay. And that's safe.
Oh, I love that. And do you know, by the way, how you could have more fun?
For me, I've done little things like I now listen to music in the mornings, or like we had a
Yes.
dance party like at dinner the other day, just little stuff. And so I'm starting
Yeah.
small, but I
Yeah.
think that will over time lead to bigger moments.
Yes. I love, love, love that, right? This anti-hustle and sort of really being able for you to lean into that now and to say, wow, I've come far enough. I can have fun now. I mean,
Yeah,
PS, you could have had fun
yeah,
before. And I think for so many of us as adults, right, like that gets pushed to the wayside. The idea of
totally.
having any fun or joy for that matter, it's like, well, wait, what does that even look like? Which is why I asked you that question. Do you even know what that looks
Yeah,
like? Because sometimes we have to sit down and assess that. It's like, what is fun? I don't know
yeah,
what's fun anymore. Like, really, because we've just come so far from it. I happen to have a lot of fun all the time, but I understand. Kidding. No, that was
Cool.
great. Thank you
amazing.
for sharing that.
Well, Cyndie, as we wrap up here, is there anything else that you wanted to cover or get out to the audience? Yeah, before we wrap.
No, is there anything you'd like me to cover or get out to the audience before we wrap?
Well, I was going to put it more directly. Maybe the summit that we'll be having starting in a couple days is about rethinking and unlearning, and so you've already hit a lot of those
Yeah.
elements. But anything else that stands out related to leadership that you think is
Yeah.
really important at this stage for us to be rethinking or unlearning?
Yeah. I think something that we want to rethink is conformity. Being like everybody else around us, right? We're going to talk about this at the summit, but this idea that, the leaders we remember, the leaders that impact us the most are the ones that were not like everyone else. And so we really want to rethink that and instill that in our people. The idea that they do not have to conform. We want them to be themselves authentically. And that's such an overplayed word, but it really does make a difference because those are the leaders we all want to learn from.
Well, I guess last one for me then, is who has impacted you the most? I mean, you've already had a huge impact on me in this short conversation, and I'm
Oh.
super excited to meet you in person. But who has been that influential impact for you?
Ah, I had a boss when I was in my early 20s who believed in me, who allowed me to make a lot of mistakes. And she was like no one else. She was the softest, kindest, most um, she was just a very kind leader in a team of sharks for no better way to put it. And truly, like, I think people would around her not understand how she showed up like that day to day. And 20 years later, first of all, we're still friends. She is a mentor to me still. Her way of leading and doing it differently than everyone else has had such an impact on me because whenever I question why I'm not doing things like other people do, I remember her name is Kelly. I even talk about her in my last book. But her ability to be this person that was very different than everyone else around her has taught me that I could be that too, and that that's okay. And that I'll still create impact like she did.
Amazing.
Well, we'll cut out
Mhm.
the clip where you congratulated Alex, and now you can cut this out, and I'll say, "Good job, Kelly." You can give that to Kelly.
Kelly knows. Kelly
Yeah.
knows. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
all right, Cyndie. Well, if people want to learn more about you or what you do, what's the best way?
They can come to my website at cyndispiegel.com, at Instagram at Cyndie Spiegel. They can buy any of my books. I say any like there's 16. There's two. Buy one, buy both of those.
Two more than the rest of us.
That's right.
Two more. There will be many, many more, but for now there's two as of 2023.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll put those in the show notes so that people can easily
Thank
link
you.
out. But thank you, Cyndie. This was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
For sure. It's going to be great.
Thank you.